In Lincoln today, lawmakers heard testimony on a bill for gun rights advocates say would protect your privacy when you exercise your Second Amendment rights.
As First Alert 6's Joe Harris tells us, that would include guns that you purchase or that you already own.
Nebraska Firearms Owners Association Vice President Joe Goebel believes the government should not put you on a list if you own a firearm.
They're not supposed to be having a list on you. As we've seen in the past, when they've had lists and whatnot on citizens throughout history, across the world and the U.S., the creation of lists leads to the abuse and civil rights violations and facilitates confiscating.
There is no national gun registry, and Goebel's organization believes Nebraska law should align with that. That's why they support LB 686, which State Senator Dan Lanuski introduced. If passed, state entities would not be allowed to keep records or registries of firearms ownership. Exceptions would include keeping records during a criminal investigation.
It basically protects Nebraskans in case the federal government sometime in the future would try to change that.
LB 686 would also prohibit companies that process credit or debit card transactions from assigning firearms retailers merchant category codes, or MCCs, that distinguish them from other retailers. The bill's supporters say coding credit card purchases is an assault on privacy and Second Amendment rights.
The creation of these MCCs, the stated purpose is to track those purchases with the end goal of making it more difficult to purchase firearms and ammunition, as well as to create lists that can be tracked. The right to privacy in your purchases of firearms and other constitutionally protected items, I think is of the utmost importance.
Opponents say the bill does nothing to protect the firearms industry from these perceived threats.
The MCC categories apply to merchants. Individual products do not have a separate MCC. As such, MCCs could never be used to facilitate a gun registry and collect no specific data that could ever be associated with a particular firearm.
Others say it would put more requirements and limit rights on community banks.
Community banks specifically are often not in a position to negotiate with these credit card processing companies and merchant processing companies. So that puts us at a disadvantage that we can't really control what those payment processors are going to do, but we still need to serve our customers.
And they believe that could cost them customers. In Omaha, Joe Harris, First Alert 6.
Both bills must make it out of committee before lawmakers debate them on the floor.